a little bit more on the material, but also emphasise some of what Mike has been saying about the environmental issue. It's why we're here. It's why I've been doing this job for 30 years, is because there are forests out there that we could utilise a lot more. This is a resource that is huge and is available. It's a long-term thing. I couldn't possibly stand up with passion and talk about a material if it was limited or rare or in danger. And I think it's to try and balance that perception. I've worked in tropical countries back in the 1980s when we began to realise what was happening. So I understand that side of the story, and we should still fear that there is still a lot of issues that need to be addressed. Personally, my view is that we should be encouraging more use of the tropical forest resources in those countries, building infrastructure, engineering, making products with that material, rather than trying to necessarily trade it around the world like we used to. So our focus as our wood baskets, our source of wood, has shifted over the last 20, 30 years, more away from the tropical forests because of more limited availability, because we've taken out the timbers that we wanted and we've left the other ones behind. But also because our fears about sustainability and legality. But it's agriculture actually that is often driving this change of land. And then we're looking for more environmental solutions. So we focus on soya or palm oil, or the developing countries do, because it's about money and revenue. But you've got to look very carefully at those kind of plantations. What are you removing to create a plantation so that we can all have palm oil in our products and the things that we eat? Again, there's a massive global problem, and we can't solve that with one project or as a small group, but we can focus in what we can do with our professional experience and our, you as designers, us as people who understand material, because this is a good story, and we can start to use it to say, actually, you can make change and be more positive, and that's really what this whole thing is about. So we start by an enormous, as Mike's already said, this is a massive resource. This is where the hardwoods are, and it's east of the Mississippi River. You've got about 2,500 miles geographically, so it's a massive area. And what is interesting about this forest, that there are some hardwoods up here, but a lot of the softwoods, use pointers better. Obviously, this is agricultural Northwest. This is quite an important timber area, but you've got a lot of the industrial softwood plantations, pulp, paper, more industrial land ownership in this area and then up into Canada. But you have some hardwoods in here, a little bit of oak, a bit of maple wood, and also alder. Western red alder has been used in furniture and product design. That comes mainly from the West. But the rest of it, and they're all timbers, most of them you will know from Europe. So we have oaks, we have maples, we have cherry, we have walnut. But then we've got timbers in that mix like hickory, tulip wood, which I'll talk about. We also have equivalents to the European poplar, but they're slightly different. Some grow in the north, some grow in the south. And I think the point to make is the diversity, and I'll talk about some of the species in a minute, but the diversity of this forest is enormous and is more varied than our hardwood forests in Europe. Partly because the mountain ranges, it all goes back to the Ice Age. So if you think about Europe, the mountain ranges are running this way. So when the Ice Age came, a lot of the fauna and flora was wiped out when it ran out into the mountains. Whereas the mountain ranges with, the Rockies, the Appalachians, you've got like a funnel. So a lot of that fauna and flora survived. So when the ice receded, you've actually got more diversity. And certainly within tree species, you've got huge diversity in these forests. Now, we don't focus on all of them. There's hundreds and hundreds of different species, but there are at least 20 or so that are commercially available, that are used within industries in the US, they're exported. And within that, there are more important ones in terms of volume or in terms of their mix in the forest, as Mike was saying. Again, we'll talk a bit more about that. While I have the map up, I'm going to talk about the species in a minute, but it's worth bearing in mind, you've got a huge geographical area, so they're almost different climates. The way the trees grow down here in the Mississippi, Tennessee, is going to be very different from how they grow up in Maine, New Hampshire. This is a colder weather climate, so your growing seasons may only be 2-3 months. Whereas down here, you're going to have 8, 9, maybe even 10 months growth. So trees grow faster, therefore the wood looks a little different, even within the same species. So we're focusing this project on red oak. Your red oak will look different from there to down there. And it's worth bearing in mind, for future use, that if you're after, but that adds a variety, but it's also a challenge, particularly with architects trying to match colours or within product manufacture. So it's something to understand, but also that variation is dictated by soil, by topography, how high the trees are growing. So for example, in the Appalachian Mountains, even though you're down in the south there, say in North Carolina, if your trees are growing at altitude, the wood is going to look more like it came from here. So these factors are all at play. But you also get, within the species, subspecies. So if we use the example of oak, some of you might have used or worked with European oak, the lighter coloured oak we have in Europe. It's essentially one botanical species. It's how it varies will be, it might look a bit different if it came from Croatia as opposed to northern Spain, or the forests of Germany or France, because of the soil changes. So there are small changes, but essentially you get something that is more uniform, probably. What we have in America, we're an oak-dominated forest, so there are groups of oaks called the white oaks, which are lighter in colour, a little bit heavier, and then there are a group of oaks called the red oaks. Within those two groups, there are hundreds of different species, so it gets very complicated. But actually, in each group, you've got about 6 or 8 species that commercially find their way, in terms of volume, into sawmills to be turned into timber. But not only have you got, when you get down in the south here, you've got species of red oak, for example. There is a subspecies called cherry bark red oak. That only grows in the south, so the wood will look a little different. But in terms of our industry, we can't separate it all, so we mix it in. So I think this is all about, just be aware, this is a huge, massive resource that's available, but we do need to think a little bit about its origin or the different species, how they might vary. Some of them, like tulip wood, is pretty uniform, it's a single species, and that will grow here, everywhere, and it will only look different in the south because it's a little faster grown. But essentially, look will be the same. But things like the oaks, you get a lot of variety within. Same with the maple woods, you get different types of maple as well, and they can vary in colour. So just sort of covering that. That might explain to you when you're looking at the samples later why they don't all look the same, and you can look at the end grain and you can see how quickly the trees are growing. It gives you an idea of it all affects the appearance. So back to the size. Just to put it into context. This is the land area. This is just hardwood in those forests. If you took everything else out, put them all together in terms of land area, it's an enormous land area. It's not, in case you're wondering, a post-Brexit map of Europe. It's just that the UK, I couldn't fit in the land area, so we chose these countries instead. Yeah, we won't talk any more about that. Maybe over a beer tonight. Just go. So it's enormous, and Mike talked about this massive growth that we're getting, in terms of 150 million cubic meters. I mean, how do you talk about those numbers? That's one way to put it. That's the standing volume in the forests. This is the kind of growth of all these hardwoods together that we're getting every year. So you put it into context, because of all this satellite mapping and the growth data that we have, we can tell 5 cubic meters worth is added every second into that forest. Or to put it another way, 7 Olympic-sized swimming pools every hour, to try and give you an idea of scale. Just going back, so Mike talked about we don't plant. This nature is doing it for us, and nature does it really prolifically. So, to give you an example, Pennsylvania as a state, when the settlers arrived 300 years ago, that was over 80% forested, that whole state, and it's a big state on the East Coast. By the 1900s, Industrial Revolution, all the cities, roads, mines, industry that was built, a lot of that timber was felled for the Industrial Revolution, the whole sort of process. And by 1900, Pennsylvania was down to barely 7% forest, because they cleared it. By which time a lot of the agricultural activity had moved into the Midwest to better agricultural land, away from the hilly East Coast, where they'd first settled. So now, today, on current mapping, we're nearly 70% forest again in Pennsylvania, which is extraordinary. That is natural regeneration. That's nature, the power of nature. If you allow that land to recover, then it will recover to that extent. And if you think of the cities and the roads and the infrastructure in a state like Pennsylvania, you've still got all those trees. And if you fly in the States, on small planes going between cities, if you've done it, you may well have done, then you'll know what I mean. You fly at 5,000 feet and for an hour and a half, all you see is forest. So it's on a scale, even in Europe, that we find difficult to understand. This is the key to sustainability. We can discuss all day about labelling and the pros and cons of labelling and chain of custody, and a tick isn't necessarily a guarantee of sustainability. That's one thing I would implant with you. I'm not saying it isn't part of demonstrating sustainability, certification, but ultimately we've got to have more growth than harvest. And good management, Mike talked about that, it's important. These forests were interfered with when the settlers first arrived hundreds of years ago. So there isn't old growth forest. This is second, third, fourth generation growth. So you've got to keep managing it. And then you keep the value in the forest, and you keep the quality in the forest, and then you get everything. You get biodiversity, you get material for products. Mike, you didn't talk about the map, did you? I've only got one slide of it because I thought Mike was going to show it. We would really encourage you, after today, if you go onto our website, americanhardwood.org, we've started to visualise some of the big data that we're dealing with. And I think it's really important. You may have looked at this already, and you can go and have a look at red oak, you can see where it grows, you can see which states are growing more. And what's really important, what we're looking for here, is net growth. So we take all this satellite data for the US Forest Service. We used to have it in big spreadsheets, and we couldn't do anything with it. Now we put it into a modelling system so that you can explore all these states and see where the forest grows, and we've done it for the 20 main species that we talk about, so that you can select those species and see where they grow. But we've also, you can drill down into here, as an example, individual states. So you can look at within a state, you say, well, if it's coming from New York State, then I can go and have a look and I can get some idea of what the policies are there. We're also going to include soon in this map the state forest action plans. This is why legality is not a problem in the US, because there is such a legislative system governing forestry. Each state has to have a forest action plan. And this has been a game changer for us, because for talking to designers like yourselves, to architects, to consumers, they can now start to get an idea of the scale and what we need. And it's also broadening the discussion away from just this idea about certification, because sometimes plantations that may not be very good for long-term diversity can have a certificate. But actually these natural forests, because of our land ownership, millions and millions of small landowners, mass certification is very difficult to achieve. So actually there's very small volumes of certified forest in the US. But this proves its sustainability, and we can show that what we're looking for is that net growth after harvest. What is going to happen? Is nature regenerating more quickly than we're harvesting? Also linked to that is the work that we've done. We've now tried to visualize the life cycle work that we've done. We did a lot of unique data collection in the US with our sawmills, so that we can understand the environmental impact of growing those trees in the forest. In other words, are we using, what kind of industrial processes do we use? And in hardwood you use very little biocide or any interference of chemicals, and so the natural forest process is very low impact. Then we look at taking those trees, turning them into timber, into veneer. What are those processes? Drying the timber so we can use it, and all these different impacts. Then we can now model them so that we can understand what the mix is. And it's not surprising when you're making a piece of timber and it's the drying, where you're using a lot of heat energy. That's one of the biggest impacts. Then of course you're going to say, well, hang on a minute, I'm a designer here in Europe and I'm working with workshops in Spain, and why should we be importing our oak or our cherry wood or whatever from the States? So surely it's better to use my local resource. And of course it is, if you know where your material is coming from and it's localized. But in the large industrial world of design, that's sometimes very difficult. It's not always possible to do that. Or you don't have the wood resource that you want locally. So what are you going to use? Use another material? One that, Mike showed you the jazz and the different materials. The environmental sense says, well, hang on a minute, my customers want wood, I love designing with wood, surely it's a better environmental impact, that's what I should be focusing on. So therefore you say, well, if I'm sourcing it, what's the impact on the environment? So the simple thing in terms of carbon impact is that moving things around the world by sea freight has a much lower impact than by road or rail. So as an approximate comparison, 6,000 kilometres by sea has the same carbon impact as 600 kilometres by road. So if your oak is coming from Germany to Spain, it's going to have the same or bigger impact than your container that comes into Vigo or somewhere from Pennsylvania. So we had to be sure, looking at the life cycle numbers, because I wouldn't feel comfortable standing in Europe trying to promote, a hardwood or promote it on the other side of the world if it was having a large environmental impact. And it doesn't. And we reassured ourselves so that we can reassure you. So, localism isn't always diversity. It might apply to food or some other products, but in terms of wood, you can think much broader than that. And so we should therefore be thinking globally, where can we increase or change the balance between materials that aren't renewable, that have a much higher impact to produce, thinking concrete, for a start. One of the biggest polluters on the planet is the cement industry, and yet we're still not building enough in wood. We can now build, as I'll show you, huge cities, timber towers, big infrastructure in timber, so we should be changing. So that's the message behind all this, and this helps us communicate that, and it will help you understand the impact of the material. What you then gets really interesting, and is what we don't know is what are those impacts when you actually start making something, because that's where the most impact will come from. You've got your raw material, it's here in Spain, you're now going to turn it into something. What about the other materials that you have to use, within your product design? In this particular table, working with an Italian furniture producer of high-end solid wood. This is walnut. This is a brushed, recycled steel base. So it was a very interesting example. And although the mass of the product is in the top, actually the base has the bigger carbon footprint. Because of its impact. And we can also, by using the information on the map, we can start to say for each product or structure, how quickly that material is replaced in the forest. And of course, anything you make in wood has carbon stored in it, so it's huge important. We want, for this project, those selected designs that go forward to prototyping, we want to collect the data, because we know all the data about red oak as a raw material. We want to collect the processing data so that actually we can produce a series of impacts. And we've done it before in other projects, but I would like to revisit it again for this project. And just some basics on this, it might seem obvious, but actually wood is the only material that's also a fuel. You can burn it for biomass and generate energy from it, as well as make products from it. So if you're thinking about recycling, you're thinking about circular economy, if we can use less glues, less chemicals, or use them in the right way, then we can recycle or we can burn for biomass. So when you start doing life cycle calculations, wood is very advantageous because any wastage in the process can be offset against the use of fossil fuels. When we're all using renewable energy, that calculation won't be quite so good. But at the moment, in many countries, certainly for us in the UK, we still are relying on a lot of fossil fuel. And overall, anything you make in wood, the environmental, the scientific numbers, it's low compared with most other materials. So you're starting from a very low base anyway, as an advantage. And we've done, experiments with students. This was a group of students at the Royal College of Art in London we worked with some years ago. where they were each making a seat, and we introduced the idea of life cycle, and they collected the data. It's very easy to just, I think Sebastian has done a lot of that in his work, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's collecting, the energy of the machine processing, not the hand processing. It's weighing your glues, your fixings, fittings, and obviously timber in, timber out. And then we can put all that into a modelling system together with energy mixes and that data which is available to us. And you can start to produce a series of impacts on, and you can look at the different products and you can see here a lot of material used, because although that looks very thin, there was a lot of wastage and engineering going on to make a very long bench that you could pick up literally with your small finger. It was so lightweight. And here was an interesting, this actually has become a very recognised design. It's using biomass and resin from the processing of the base to create, using just a standard day mould chair. I talked about the diversity of the species, and this is really important because Mike referred, he had a different way of looking at it, but this is the mix in terms of volume. And this is why we want to talk about this species, red oak, because in a sense we're introducing a new material. Not just to you as a group, but we're doing it with all sorts of projects all over Europe right now, because Europe has its own oak, is focused historically on white oak. It's what we're comfortable with, it's what industries are comfortable with, and that has been the kind of the resistance. So we have this amazing resource, this really good performing timber that's just not being used. It's being underutilised, and that will affect our ability to be sustainable in the long term. So it's not just that we want to promote for our timber companies, so they can sell more red oak. Yes, of course, it is all about business in the end. Everything we do is related to business, but there's something more fundamental underneath it. One of the problems with destruction of forests in the tropical regions is that we started taking out just the ones that we wanted and leaving everything else. And that's disturbed and changed the mix. And we mustn't do the same here. And if you follow fashion and wood fashion in architecture or in product design, you will know at the moment that we're very polarized, because we're focusing basically on oak, and what we mean is what we call the white oaks and the European oaks. They're very similar. And where is it? Walnut. There's a bit of ash, there's a bit of maple, there's some other thing, but that's essentially, if you look at most furniture design at the moment, most flooring, most interiors, it's oak. Yes, you can finish it and scratch it and stain it, make it look a little different, but it's fundamentally just the one species. So there's all that focus. We're trying to get everyone to design more with wood, consumers to buy and appreciate wood products, but if it's all on one species, it can't be sustainable. So why leave an oak out? The only reason you would ignore this is if it wasn't any good, if it didn't perform. Well, we've been proving that it's as good, if not better, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. But you can see here, global focus on walnut, exotic, beautiful, very expensive. Most of it comes from America. We have very little commercial walnut of any volume left in Europe. So you can see why it gets more expensive. There's a pressure on it, even with our big timber resource. It's only 1%. The oaks together, that's the bulk of our forests, and that's where our focus is. But you can see also the mix of the others, and it produces this huge variety of all these timbers will do different things. Decorative, tulip wood, I'll mention in a moment, extraordinary strength for its weight, so you can make structures from it. You know, the oaks, fantastic for, you know, specialist structural work, as well as, you know, flooring, furniture, joinery, windows. I mean, you can use veneer for more delicate things. I mean, there's infinite possibilities. And then there's also all those different palettes of colour, even before you start thinking about artificial finishes. So, you know, it is an enormous palette. So for artists, you've got a lot to work with, even within the different species. I don't know if you were going to mention this, but the oaks can be very difficult to tell the difference. So we've got samples of red oak for you. We've also got hand samples that have got white oak and red oak in them. It's often very difficult to tell the difference, because I can show you red oak that looks quite white in colour, and I can show you white oaks that actually look a little bit pink. Red oak is not called red oak because of the colour of the wood. It's the colour of the leaves in the autumn. So the red oaks have very bright red leaves when you know, they change at the end of the season. And that's where the terminology, it differentiates that group of species from the white oaks, and they differentiate by colour of leaves. One of the ways we tell is these very small, you'll see them, little ray tissues. It's where the tissues in the wood, not only you've got tubes going up and down this way, but you also have structure or cells, tissue that come out radially. And you will see these often, if you know beech wood, that we use a lot in Europe, they have little flecks as well. This looks a little bit like this. The flecks in red oak are always shorter than they are in white oak. It's a quick way to tell, or at least to have an idea. The other way you can tell with red oak, and Sebastian's going to explain what he did with this knowledge, you can blow through it. So the tubes in red oak are clear. So you can actually take your samples and you can blow air through them. You can't, it's not really in the big picture, but there are an increasing number of really important examples which are helping us show that it can perform, it's warm, it looks good. I mean, most designers and architects we talked about, they love it. It's industries are not familiar with it. So we're trying to do these projects to also inspire industries through you and your work, that this is a timber we should be using more. This is Foster's extraordinary design for Bloomberg headquarters in London. It's been in all the architectural press. It had a ridiculous budget. It won the Sterling Prize for architecture in the UK. But for us, it's really exciting because there was an enormous amount of red oak in it, which was specifically chosen by Michael Bloomberg. He lives in New York State, and they've got a lot of red oak, and it's on all the flooring. It's that extraordinary vortex hall as you go in, is all in red oak as well. But we are seeing you can use it at a much smaller scale within joinery, fitted furniture, stairs, windows, flooring, and then some of the other timbers as well that we're not using at the moment. You know, the warmer colours of cherry. There was a big fashion for cherry wood 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, and that's faded away, but it's still, it's the most fabulous timber to work with in terms of furniture design and product design. And again, we're starting to see that coming back in. So this message, I think if we're only focusing on these narrow species, we're also not giving the consumer a choice. And that's really important. You know, we want consumers to be excited about our designs and about wooden products. Well, you've got to make them exciting and choice. You don't want to walk every shop and see basically exactly the same looking thing. Everyone's doing the same thing. So we're trying to encourage to explore what's out there and look differently. And there's a number of high-profile architects who've contacted us recently and said we want to work with cherry again. You know, tell us about it. And Ian Ritchie and his extraordinary Music Academy space is an example of that. But also the same applies to maple. You know, we used it a lot 10 or 15 years ago. It's still used for sports halls and specialist uses because it's very hard wearing. But again, we've seen less of it, but I think this is certainly one, and using it in contrast with darker timbers is often always an interesting thing. And then you've got things like hickory, not necessarily for furniture product. It's very hard, it's quite heavy timber, and it comes with all this natural colour. And again, we've got to get used to, if we're going to use hardwoods from Europe, we're going to use them from North America. You know, tropical timbers, they grow all year round. You get very little colour variation. All the timber looks the same. So for processing, it's very easy. You can see why industries in the 70s used a lot of tropical timber. It was easy work. And you know, everything had the same colour. This is much more challenging, but the effects are much more exciting. This is, believe it or not, red oak. So it's difficult with the colour, but with a whitening oil and a change of finish, you can take it. This is a new range about to be launched in the UK by one of our leading retailers, John Lewis, also the Waitrose Group. They do a lot of online furniture sales as well as in store. And their furniture actually is not made in Europe, it's made in Turkey. But we've been talking to them about the importance of changing the mix. They do a lot of white oak furniture at the moment. So it just shows you can bring something commercially to the market. This is going to be very interesting to see the reaction to this. And you know, you can, with clever craftsmanship and finishing, you know, change the look of the natural timber. In this case, lightening it. Before we started this project and invited you to take part, and a number of other projects that we are doing at the moment involving design collaboration with making, we wanted to be absolutely sure that this red oak is good enough. Now, I'm a woodman, I've been doing this for a long time, but I don't make anything. You know, I'm very embarrassed. I could tell you all about the timber, but I couldn't make you a chair or a table. I'm really not very good. I understand it, and I understand good design. But all the feedback we've ever had, you know, this red oak timber is what they use for everything in the US and have done for 100 years or more, for their flooring, for their kitchens, for the panelling, for you know, as veneer, as solid lumber. It's been used extensively in China in the last 10, 15 years. All the feedback is, it works. There's lots of products out there, it's just not in Europe. We have a mindset in Europe that blanks it out because the oak we know is different. So we wanted to make sure, are we absolutely right? You know, if we're going to get designers and craftsmen working with it, is it going to do everything we want it to do? So we set up a series of tests in a large workshop in the UK where the craftsmen themselves, and I'm just going to show you a short film in a second, although it's in English, I think it does show what we did. But we did a whole series of finishing tests, different oils, different stains, charring, using ammonia. We steam bent, turned, did a whole, we made furniture joints and then broke them. So we were looking at all those things that are important that go into what you need from a material if you're making furniture or products in wood. And we did, for each experiment, we looked at southern red oak. My pointer back again. So that's northern red oak, southern red oak, and we made a comparison with American white oak and European oak. And you can see here, just actually from this photo, that there is a structural difference between these white oaks and the red oaks, making them more porous. But you can also see a very good example. That's when it's grown in the north, the growth rings are closer together. That's immediately more southern. It's more open. You're getting more growth in each annual growth cycle. And so we compared all these results, and the red oak is the green. So we were looking there, and we're on a par, or in some processes that were better. So spindle moulding, planing by hand, working with hand, it worked better. And it was nearly as good in almost all the other, cutting mitre joints, for example, there. And then we looked specifically, again, at jointing on, I think that's we term cross-grain jointing for them. Wasn't quite as good, but then in terms of other joint techniques, it was very much on a par. And then we looked at all the different kinds of finishing, in some in terms of UV, in terms of ebonising, but the other finishing, it was all very comparable. And it was a very interesting exercise for us to try and understand the differences. I don't think the workshop had never done this before. They used mostly European oak. They'd never used red oak. So these craftsmen themselves, got to the end of this week. They set up the experiments and they went, this is a really great material, actually. We would be very comfortable making things with it. And it's good because I'm doing a project with them at the moment. So I'm very pleased that they were happy and comfortable with working with it. And if you just indulge me, if we can have the sound, can we have the sound up? Wake up the sound now. I'm just going to play this. This is what we did. Oh. What's happened? How do I lift that?